Please pray with me. God, may the words of my mouth and the meditations of all of our hearts be acceptable in your sight. You are our strength and our Redeemer. Amen. Cultural anthropologist Margaret Mead is perhaps best remembered for saying, "Never doubt that a small group of thoughtful, committed people can change the world. Indeed, it is the only thing that ever has." This was Mead's field of study, watching and charting how cultural change happens, and she could expertly attest that big change rarely comes from the top down, but really it's mostly grassroots. It starts small and it grows, and most of the time, if there is a change made from the top down, it's simply in response to the ground swelling beneath. Certainly this is true of the ancestors of our faith, both Old as well as New Testament, are basically just stories of groups of people who believed in something bigger than themselves, who had faith in the one who created them, who were willing to make mistakes and get up and try again, and who were bothered enough by what was going on around them to do something to change it. We're continuing our theme of prayer this week. Last week, Tom talked about the Lord's Prayer, and on that model, we practice 4 types of prayer. We practice prayers of adoration, confession, prayers for self, prayers for others and the world, and then prayers of thanksgiving. These are kind of the bones of prayer, if you will. They're great places to start, and it's important to come back to them time and time again. They're a little bit like playing scales. They are. It's like, oh yeah, now I know what I'm doing. Well, it's similar with those types of prayer. And we use the Lord's Prayer as an example of that type of prayer. There's also something, though, that gets a little bit lost in our translation of the Lord's Prayer. For example, when we pray, as we just did, lead us not into temptation, we might be thinking about, things like chocolate or cigarettes or, fill in the blank, lead us not into temptation, keep us from that thing we struggle with. But the reality is that for the hearers and sayers of this, the original ones, it meant nothing like that. A better translation, for example, was probably save us from the time of trial. And they literally meant save us from being put on trial. Because people all around them were being put on trial, such as Jesus, not being treated very well, and most of them ended up being crucified. So it literally means save us from death. Now, and that sort of maybe sheds a different kind of light on keep us and save us from, deliver us from evil. They meant very much the very real and pressing evil that was all around them, doing things like killing people left and right. And then for them to pray and say at the end, because yours is the kingdom and the power and the glory forever, well, that's in contrast to the kingdom they had to live in and under every single day, which is basically a reign of terror. I say this not to disrupt our nice and comfortable relationship with the Lord's Prayer, but rather to also let you know that it wasn't exactly comfortable the way we say it sitting in our pews. Every single word of it dripped with an urgency that might be hard for us to relate to most of the time. Yet I bet there are some of us out there, probably most of us, who might have had the experience of praying with that kind of urgency at least once in life, that kind of hair is on fire kind of urgency, the heat of a prayer that is almost saying itself, like it's nice that you're there, but it might say itself anyway. It's going to get itself said. A prayer that big. That's the kind of prayer, that's the kind of urgency that our spiritual ancestors knew. And this is what our good friend Habakkuk was doing. This prophet was literally standing on the watchpost and watching and praying and saying, God, what are you going to do? They're coming. They're coming to get us and take us away, and we don't know what they're going to do with all of your people. So are you going to answer? God does indeed answer Habakkuk, and God says, listen, get out a pen. It's time to write the vision. Write the vision and make it plain, not in fancy language, not in some sort of code, plain speak that everyone can read, and in big enough letters that everyone can see it, so that the runner, which is the courier, the one who's running with this message, can read it, even while he runs. And God says to Habakkuk, there is a vision, and it will happen in time, and until then, you just simply got to trust me. You just got to trust me, but wait for it. And remember, the righteous live by faith. So one thing Habakkuk doesn't tell us, though, is what this vision actually is. We don't know. What we know about it is that a big piece of it is trusting and waiting for the right time, that we don't exactly know the right time. So I think that there is space here. Actually, I think there is a necessity here for us to write visions. Visions of what God's realm on our earth actually looks like. Think about it. This happens a lot, especially right now. Our friends who are in Ferguson, lots of clergy, lots of religious leaders this weekend are writing visions about a world where there are fewer dark bodies gunned down on the street and in our jails. They are writing visions. Dr. King wrote visions. Certainly we recite it and know it well, the I Have a Dream speech. Jesus wrote visions and was doing that when he prayed that they may all be one. So friends, we can write visions. In fact, we are asked to write visions. Because we have dreams as well, do we not? One of the things that comes up for me as I sit with this question of, yes, we have dreams and desires, and we can, in fact, we are called to write visions. The question for me comes up, but how can I know and trust it's not just my ego that's writing a vision? How can I know and trust it's just not my selfish desires projecting something here? One of the things I know is that as we are on the path of discipleship, which is sort of our theme for this fall, what does it mean to walk in the way, to be a follower of Jesus? Well, one of the things that happens when we're on this path is that if we're really walking it, then our ways and God's ways, our desires and our heart, and God's desires and God's heart get a little bit closer together. It's kind of like when you have a really good friend and you spend more and more time with that really good friend. You sort of start to have similar gestures. You may finish each other's sentences. You may even sometimes dress alike, like you meet for coffee and you're wearing the same thing. It's kind of like that with God. The more time we spend with God, the more like God we become. So I think that we are called to pour out our heart's desires and to pray like our hair is on fire, even when the stakes aren't life and death. But it takes courage, and it takes a lot of boldness, and it takes the willingness to be even perhaps a little bit dangerous. But the Spirit's imagination and power is far, far greater than anything we can scheme up. So we could push the edge of being as bold as possible, and it doesn't come close to God's ability to be creative and bold and do things we never thought possible. So, friends, we're called to write visions. 18 years ago, Frank and Brad found themselves writing a vision on a paper napkin at a diner. They were brand new into their relationship, but they decided there was enough here that they were going to make a go of it. Something was happening here, and they didn't really want to mess around. So over breakfast, they pulled out a paper napkin and they wrote 3 things. Here's what we agreed to. The first is monogamy. This will be an exclusive relationship. The second is that we will not go to bed while still being angry with each other. We will talk it out, whatever we need to, before we go to bed. The third being, we're both going to do our part to make this relationship work. It's not going to just be one person doing all the work. It's going to be a joint venture. That was 18 years ago. They have a wonderful tradition on the anniversary of the paper napkin vision. Frank cooks a lovely dinner, decorates the house, polishes the finest silver, pulls out the china, and they decorate the dining room with the cards they've given each other over these many years. They sometimes, if we're lucky enough, invite a few close friends over for dinner. Over dinner, these cards are read and shared out loud, and wishes are given, and gratitude is given for the years that have come and the years that are coming. I'm fortunate enough to have found myself at their table over the years. In fact, on their 14th anniversary, just before I moved to New York to begin seminary, it was an emotional time for all of us. It was their anniversary, which is always wonderful, but I was about to leave. And so we sat around and exchanged these words, and it was this beautiful poetry that really rivaled some of my very favorite poets. Glasses were lifted, toasts were said, and somehow in that moment, this crazy idea was put out there that was, well, Barbara, you're going off to seminary, and you're probably going to maybe get ordained, and, well, when you do, you're going to marry us. There wasn't really much marriage happening for the gay folk at that time. So it seemed like a crazy idea. But we raised our glasses and said, yes, that's what we will do. And little did we know that we were writing a vision. We also knew, though, that the chances of marriage equality coming to a place like North Carolina were pretty slim. They probably wouldn't happen in our lifetime, so we'd have to settle for maybe someplace exotic like New York. 2 years ago, our dire predictions that marriage equality in North Carolina would be impossible seemed to become a reality when a marriage ban was passed. It was a very painful few months leading up to the vote. A lot of targeted ads at my community in North Carolina. A lot of pain, a lot of hate, all very unnecessary. I was sort of tucked away in the cloister of my seminary up at Union in Manhattan. But on that night, I was glued to the TV, and I was very connected to my friends back home. And the sad, painful results were rolling in. And of course, the ban was passed, but this ban not only forbid already forbidden gay marriage in North Carolina, it also made it a crime for clergy of any type to perform any type of ceremony for a same-sex couple, a crime punishable by jail time. So this was a very far-reaching amendment. Frank and I spoke on the phone that night through tears, and he said, I walk around our house, and I just am flooded with memories of Christmas Eve brunches, Thanksgiving dinners, pictures of our family and friends everywhere, and I just don't get it. Why is this so threatening? And I said, yeah, but you two know. You know what marriage really is, and no one can take that away from you. And little did we know that we were writing the vision. At my ordination last year, Frank and Brad, of course, hosted a brunch. And as we circled up to say the prayer, they said, all right, let's let the wedding planning begin. You will marry us in New York. And again, glasses were raised, and it was agreed this was going to happen, and some planning began. And then in May, a funny thing happened. Our denomination, the United Church of Christ, wrote a broad and sweeping vision in the form of a lawsuit. And they sued the state of North Carolina for taking away religious freedom, that of clergy. It was a brilliant move on our part. We also had great legal advice and expertise. And suddenly it seemed like the walls around this marriage ban were actually starting to erode. And Frank called and he said, let's hold off on this New York thing. Because if we can get married at home, we're going to wait. Let's just wait a little bit. So we waited. And indeed, the vision was being written because yesterday morning, Frank and Brad were on the cover of almost every newspaper in North Carolina and on NPR because some miracles happened this week, and it looked like this marriage ban may actually fall in the way of so many others. So they ran to the courthouse, and lo and behold, they were the first ones there. A bunch of reporters and Frank and Brad. And so their story of 18 years together, their clear love for each other, has spread like wildfire across the state. They were officially married Friday night, the first couple in Guilford County, and we are now planning the actual ceremony, which I will head down south to do in just a few weeks. So, this union, this vision, of course, seemed impossible on so many levels. And also, it brought light. It is bringing light and hope so many places. I was struck yesterday as I was just reading all this coverage on my best friends, and then also remembering that it was the 16th anniversary of Matthew Shepard's death. It was also National Coming Out Day. And God says, write the vision and make it plain, and I will do what I say. You probably have guessed, but I consider visionary prayer, that kind of really bold, pushing the edge kind of prayer, really important, really courageous, completely necessary. And as I said, it is dangerous in this way. It's dangerous because it might just wake us up from our own unchallenged assumptions and comfortable habits. For us, for example, as a church, as a community, to pray for growth, it might just mean we get what we pray for. It might just mean that, in fact, we are changed, that we as a community look different and take on a different flavor because everyone is welcome here. And this, my friends, is a wonderfully dangerous prayer. It seems, though, that sometimes what is true for people in our lives is also sometimes true for churches. And that is this, that a lot of times it takes losing a whole lot or being in some sort of crisis to be willing to do the thing that is so risky. Sometimes it takes losing everything, hitting bottom, whatever it is you want to say, to make the changes that are needed. Certainly this is often true for people. There's a lot of talk among my colleagues that a lot of times it's really, really hard to motivate a comfortable church or a comfortable community to make the changes that are needed. In fact, you hear a lot of stories these days about churches that are being resurrected, but they usually start with something like, we were about to close our doors. And then, because we had nothing left to lose, we did this wild and crazy thing. And look what happened. You hear a lot of stories like this, and they're incredibly inspirational, and I think they're really true. So I hear my friends and my colleagues say, yeah, it's really hard with a comfortable church. But I don't think it's impossible. Is it hard? Yes. Is it possible? Absolutely. So friends, you may know this, but we're kind of comfortable. We are. Things are pretty good. We love each other. It's a beautiful place. We do amazing, wonderful things, and yet I think we are being asked to do more. I think that we're being asked to dig deep down and to find the bold, courageous prayer, to write the bold, courageous vision that God is calling us to write. And I think that we can do it. I think that we can listen to the Spirit and that we can respond now. Because we are that small group of thoughtful, committed folks who can change the world. We cannot help but be, because it is in our spiritual DNA. It's who we are. It's where we come from. It is what we are born to do. So, dear ones, what would your biggest, wildest, craziest prayers be? If you were to pray as boldly as possible without fear, to push the limits of what you think is possible, what would you pray? You have 2 index cards in your bulletin. One of those is for your own vision, for yourself, for your life. One of those is your own wild and crazy vision for this community, for this church. If you're not a part of this church and you find yourself visiting today, feel free to make it about any community that feels like home to you, that is meaningful to you. So take a few minutes, if you can, and do just a little bit of writing. Write the vision and make it plain. There are no limits for yourself, for us as a community. While you're writing, actually when you're done writing, there will be a bowl up here, not up the steps, but just at the base of the steps. And we're going to be singing a song called Write the Vision. The choir will lead us in that. As we're singing, you're invited to bring your vision forward, put it in the bowl, and leave it there. I will keep all of these. They will be confidential. They will not be hung up around for people to see, but I will pray over them. In my regular time of prayer for us, I will be praying over these visions. And I believe it was Eric Hansen who wrote about taking risk, and who wrote in response to someone who asked, "But what if I leap, and what if I fall?" And the response being, "But, my darling, what if you fly?" You are invited to write your vision.